Have you ever felt like you had everything? The job, the routine, the comfort, but still, something was missing? What if the peace you've been searching for isn't out there at all, but quietly waiting inside you? Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support is what keeps us going and helps us bring you more meaningful content, week after week. Now, let's begin the journey. The sound of footsteps and car horns mixed in the air like background noise in a busy movie. People were rushing down the sidewalks, eyes glued to their phones, earbuds tucked in, coffee cups in hand. Downtown moved fast, and so did life. But for Anime, sitting alone in his small apartment 12 floors above it all, things felt strangely still and heavy. He had everything that was supposed to make someone feel secure. A well-paying job at a marketing firm, a one-bedroom condo with a view of the skyline, a fridge full of ready-made meals, and a closet stacked with decent suits. Nothing fancy, but more than enough. At 36, he had ticked off most of society's checkboxes. Yet, for reasons he couldn't quite name, he felt like something essential was missing. Like everyone else had received a manual on how to feel content, and he never got his copy. His evenings followed a rhythm, one that had become so routine it blurred into the background. Walk in, drop keys, microwave dinner, sit on the couch, turn on the TV, scroll through news he barely read, tap into social media for laughs that didn't last, watch another episode of something he'd already half-watched before, then scroll some more, usually until well past midnight. The silence of the room never bothered him before, but lately, it echoed, and he couldn't remember the last time he actually heard the sound of his own thoughts without feeling restless. That night, after finishing a box of takeout he barely tasted, he lay in bed with his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling fan. It spun in circles, quiet and steady, unlike his mind. Why do I feel tired even when I do nothing wrong? The thought surprised him. It came not as a complaint, but almost like a whisper from someplace deeper. He turned on his side, adjusting the blanket like that would somehow help. But the unease didn't go away. Instead, it brought company. Flashes of conversations he'd had and wished he handled differently. Voices from the past reminding him of things he hadn't done. Faces of people he no longer spoke to. There had been a time, years ago, when he dreamed of writing, maybe even traveling the country by train, just to feel something different. But deadlines came, promotions followed, and slowly, quietly, the dreams faded into what-ifs. Now, he was just tired. The next morning, his phone buzzed. A message from an old friend. Michael's sister. Michael's in the hospital. He collapsed at work yesterday. They're running tests. Might be burnout. He's not speaking much. Anime stared at the screen. Michael. The same friend who used to make fun of yoga and wellness blogs. The one who worked harder than anyone he knew. The last time they talked, Michael had brushed off Anime's concern about working late every night. Now he was lying in a hospital bed. An hour later, Anime stood beside that bed. Michael looked pale, thinner somehow. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he barely moved. His sister said he hadn't spoken much since the collapse. Anime tried to think of something comforting to say but couldn't find the words. Instead, he just sat there for a while, the sterile hospital lights buzzing overhead. As he left, something gnawed at him. It wasn't just worry, it was recognition. He saw a reflection of himself in Michael. The late nights, the numbness, the pushing through when you should be listening inward. The thought hit him harder than he expected. Am I next? It stayed with him as he walked home, skipping the subway without even realizing it. The city didn't feel as alive tonight. It felt indifferent. People passed him without looking up. A cold breeze slipped between the buildings and touched the back of his neck. That's when he noticed the bookstore. It was small, nestled between a tailor shop and a florist. He must have walked past it 100 times. But this evening, something made him stop. There was a quote handwritten on the glass window. Peace comes not from outside, but from mastering the mind. The Buddha. He read it twice. Something about it made him pause. Not just the words, but the way they seemed to speak to that quiet question he'd had the night before. That sense of inner fatigue he couldn't quite name. Almost without thinking, he stepped inside. The place was warm, a gentle contrast to the crisp air outside. There was a soft smell of old paper and something herbal, maybe tea or incense. Wooden shelves lined the space, filled with books that didn't shout for attention like the ones on bestseller lists. No bright signs, no big displays, just quiet. A man sat behind the counter. White hair, glasses, wearing a sweater that looked older than the books. He looked up and smiled, not as a salesman, but as someone who simply saw him. "First time in here?" the man asked. Anime nodded. "Yeah, I just saw the quote." "Good one, isn't it?" the man said gently. "We change the window every week. That one always makes people stop." There was a pause. Then, almost as if he had done it 100 times before, the man reached behind the counter and handed Anime a small, worn paperback. The title read, "The Teachings of the Awakened One." "Try this," he said. "It's simple, but sometimes, simple things are the hardest to see." Anime hesitated. He wasn't the kind of person who usually reached for spiritual books. But today wasn't a usual day. He took it. That night, back in his apartment, the book rested quietly on the kitchen table. He didn't open it yet. He just sat with it. The quote from the window still echoing in his head. Peace comes not from outside. He didn't know it yet, but something had begun to shift. Not in the world around him, but in how he might one day begin to see it. The next day moved more slowly. Anime woke up without reaching for his phone. He sat on the edge of his bed a few moments longer than usual. Feet on the cool hardwood, elbows resting on his knees. Something about last night stayed with him. Not just the quote in the window or the quiet shop, but the way the old man had looked at him. Not through him, at him, like he saw something worth paying attention to. Later that afternoon, after another routine day at work, Anime found himself walking in the same direction without really deciding to. The city noise pulsed in the background, but he barely noticed. His steps took him back to the narrow sidewalk where the bookstore was tucked away between a tailor shop and the florist. The same window, the same quote, but this time, he pushed the door open without hesitation. The bell above the door gave a gentle chime. The air inside still smelled faintly of old pages and something calming he couldn't place. The man from yesterday was there, rearranging a few books near the counter. He looked up and smiled, not with surprise, but like he'd been expecting him. "You're back," he said, moving slowly but deliberately, like someone who never rushed a thing in his life. "I guess I am," Anime replied, his voice lower than usual. The man gestured toward a small wooden table near the back, where a kettle let off soft steam beside 2 cups. "Sit with me a moment," he said, "if you're not in a hurry." Anime nodded and followed. He sat down, unsure of what to say, but somehow not feeling awkward about the silence that followed. The old man poured 2 cups of tea and passed one across the table. "You looked tired yesterday," he said, not as a judgment, but like someone noticing the weather. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. Anime looked down at his tea. "I've been feeling stuck, like something's off, but I can't name it. I have a good job, decent life, but lately, I just feel numb." The old man didn't respond right away. He let the words settle. Then he leaned back slightly and said, "The mind, when untamed, drags us through suffering, but when understood, It becomes the source of freedom. Anime wasn't sure how to respond. He nodded slightly but stayed quiet, waiting. The old man reached for a small book on the table, opened it to a folded page, and turned it toward him. There, on the slightly yellowed page, was a single verse. One who is devoted to sensual pleasures, uncontrolled in senses, immoderate in eating, lazy and weak, him Mara overthrows, as the wind throws down a weak tree. The words made Anime blink. He read it again, slower this time. There was something uncomfortably familiar in them. What does it mean? He asked. The man smiled softly. There are 5 kinds of pleasures we often chase without realizing how they bind us. What we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, and what we touch. These things, by themselves, aren't evil, but when we cling to them, needing them to feel alive or valuable, they become chains. Anime nodded slowly. I guess I do chase those things. Without thinking about it. That's not unusual, the man said. Most people do. The trouble starts when we forget how to sit with ourselves without needing something from out there to make us feel okay in here. Anime took another sip of tea. But isn't it normal to want to feel good? Of course, the man replied. Wanting isn't wrong, but clinging, that's the trap. They sat in silence again. This time, it felt like part of the conversation. Anime looked around at the shelves, the worn wooden floor, the quiet light drifting through the windows. Something about this space felt different, not magical, just real. The old man reached into a drawer and pulled out a small note card. He slid it across the table. Try this, he said. Each time you feel a strong craving, food, phone, whatever, just pause. Imagine the desire like a leaf on a stream. Don't fight it, don't grab it, just notice it float by. Then return to whatever you were doing. That's it. Anime looked down at the card. The instructions were simple, but something told him it wouldn't be easy. I'll give it a try, he said, folding the card and placing it in his pocket. That evening, back in his apartment, he sat at the table with the small book. He opened it again, flipping past the first few pages until a line caught his eye. Freedom lies not in having more, but in needing less. He underlined it with a pencil. The sentence stayed with him, like a gentle bell that rang somewhere just out of sight. Instead of turning on the TV or scrolling his phone like usual, he walked over to the couch, turned off the lights, and sat quietly. 10 minutes, no sound, just him, his breath, and the noise inside his own head. The thoughts came fast. Errands he hadn't done, things he should have said at work, images from shows, and random worries. But he didn't fight them. He just sat there, breathing, watching them rise and fall like waves. When the timer on his phone chimed softly, he didn't move right away. He reached for his notebook instead, the same one that used to collect scattered to-do lists and half-finished ideas. On a clean page, he wrote, I don't know where this road leads, but it's different from any I've walked before. He closed the notebook. Not with resolution, but with curiosity. Then he sat for a moment longer, listening, not for answers, but just to be still. The morning light filtered in through the blinds with a gentleness that made Anime linger in bed longer than usual. There was no rush in his movement, no immediate pull toward his phone or the news. Instead, he sat upright, feet resting on the floor, and breathed. For the first time in a while, there was a hint of something different, not exactly joy, but a sense of possibility. It felt like a small patch of clear sky breaking through clouds that had been hanging over him for months. He remembered the old man's voice and the instructions scribbled on the note card now tucked in his wallet. Pause, observe, let the craving float by like a leaf on water. It sounded simple. It even felt doable this morning. He hadn't committed to a total transformation, just a few moments of awareness scattered throughout the day. That seemed manageable. On the way to work, he made his first conscious effort. Standing in line at the coffee shop, he usually passed the time by flipping through headlines or checking texts. But today, he left his phone in his pocket and watched people instead. A young couple bickered over something trivial. A delivery guy tapped his foot impatiently. A woman behind the counter looked exhausted but kept her smile. It wasn't dramatic, but something about seeing without judging, just observing, made the moment feel more alive. When he got to his office, the usual pressures rolled in fast. Emails piled up, meetings ran longer than they should have. Deadlines tapped on his shoulder like an impatient child. By mid-morning, his fingers were already drifting toward his phone for a quick dopamine hit. But he caught himself, noticed the urge, felt the tension in his fingers. He paused, and then, he didn't open it. It wasn't a victory parade moment, but it mattered. At lunch, he noticed how quickly he ate. Like the food was something to get through rather than something to experience. He slowed down, chewed more, tasted the crispness of the apple, the warmth of the soup. It was strange how foreign that felt, how unfamiliar it was to actually eat like he was present. By the time he got on the train home, the effort of staying mindful had started to wear on him. His mind felt like a stretched-out rubber band. He tried to watch people without judgment, but the running commentary in his head didn't stop. He caught himself critiquing strangers' clothing, posture, even the way one man spoke too loudly on the phone. And though he noticed it, the judgments kept coming like pop-up ads he couldn't quite close. That night, sitting in his apartment with the lamp casting a soft glow on the wall, he felt the weight of all that effort settle on him like a thick blanket. He gave in. The fridge door swung open. A frozen pizza landed on the tray. He ate without tasting, eyes fixed on a rerun of a sitcom he didn't even like that much. And then came the chips. And then a few scrolls through his feed. And before he realized it, 2 hours were gone, and so was the resolve he'd started the day with. The disappointment came fast. He sat in silence afterward, the wrappers and dishes like tiny pieces of evidence. His shoulders slumped. He rubbed his eyes. I can't even control something as simple as this, he muttered, a bitter edge in his voice. The quiet wasn't peaceful tonight, it felt accusing. He picked up the notebook again, not because he wanted to, but because he had nothing else left to do. The pen hesitated at first, but then the words came. At least I tried. I noticed things I never used to. It wasn't triumphant, but it was honest. He flipped to the page with the verse from the day before. One who is devoted to sensual pleasures, uncontrolled in senses, immoderate in eating, lazy and weak, him Mara overthrows, as the wind throws down a weak tree. This time, the words didn't sting. They didn't shame him. They pointed to something else. Maybe the point wasn't to be strong all at once. Maybe the real task was growing roots. Deep ones, not the kind that showed on the surface, but the kind that held when the wind picked up. He closed the notebook gently. A little while later, needing air, he stepped out onto the small balcony just outside his living room. The city was quieter than usual. A few cars passed on the street below. The wind nudged the leaves on the nearby trees. Somewhere, not too far away, a temple bell rang. Not loud, just steady, like a heartbeat he'd forgotten he had. He leaned against the railing, letting the sound settle over him. He didn't know how far he'd go on this path, or if he had what it took to stay with it. But one thing was clear. Pretending everything was fine wasn't an option anymore. In the soft air of the evening, with the glow of streetlights painting the pavement below, a thought rose to the surface, quiet, but clear. Change doesn't happen overnight, but staying asleep, that's a choice. The bookstore felt just as he remembered, quiet, warm, and welcoming in a way that didn't try too hard. It was the following Saturday. And Anime had told himself he wasn't going to go. But something about the stillness of the morning, the way the city seemed to sigh between its busy hours, made him change his mind. The old man was in his usual spot, surrounded by books that looked as if they'd been opened 1,000 times. He greeted Anime with a nod, no surprise in his eyes, just a calm acknowledgement like he'd been expecting him. "I've been trying," Anime said, settling into the same seat as before. "Some days, it feels like I'm getting somewhere. Other days, I feel like I'm falling back into old patterns." The teacher poured tea, steady hands never rushing the motion. "Suffering isn't failure," he said after a moment. "It's the first noble truth, the beginning of all wisdom." Anime held the cup but didn't drink right away. The warmth of it settled into his palms. "I always thought suffering was something to get away from," he said, "to solve or avoid. Most people do," the old man replied. "But suffering isn't the enemy. It's the messenger. It tells us something isn't understood yet." They sat with that in the air for a moment. The teacher went on to explain that suffering doesn't come from what happens in life. Not directly. It comes from how we respond to it, how we cling, push away, or misunderstand. "There are 3 roots that keep suffering alive," he said: craving, aversion, and delusion. Anime repeated them slowly. Craving, aversion, delusion. He let the words sink in. The old man spoke gently, but clearly. Craving was the hunger for more pleasure, more approval, more control. Aversion was the pushing away, the anger, the avoidance, the fear. And delusion was the fog that made us think things would stay the same, or that we were unchanging ourselves. "Most suffering isn't caused by what happens," he said. "It's caused by how tightly we hold on." Anime didn't argue, but something in him tightened. A small resistance, like a knot in his chest. He wasn't used to thinking this way. He'd always thought if he could just fix the situation, get the promotion, find the right relationship, eat better, sleep more, the rest would fall into place. But the teacher wasn't saying to fix the outer world. He was pointing toward the mind. "The world outside keeps changing," he said, "but the patterns inside, that's where the real work is." Later that afternoon, Anime walked through a quiet park on his way home, the conversation still playing in his mind. He thought about times he had clung to things, a relationship that had clearly ended. But he kept checking her social media for months, a job title he'd been proud of, even when it no longer meant anything. The image of himself as someone who had it all together, even when he didn't. One memory returned more vividly than the others: the day he got laid off from his first job out of college. He remembered the crushing weight in his chest, not from losing the paycheck, but from feeling like he'd lost who he was. He'd built his sense of self around a role, and when it vanished, so did his identity. He'd never connected the dots until now. Back in his apartment, he sat down with his notebook. But this time, instead of just recording the day, he did something different. He wrote about a moment from earlier in the week, a tense meeting where he'd felt overlooked, and traced the emotion back to its root. He realized it wasn't about the meeting. It was about wanting to be seen, about a fear that he didn't matter unless someone acknowledged him. He kept writing. Another memory came up, a quiet Thanksgiving dinner years ago when his parents had barely asked him about his life. That old ache of invisibility. It was all connected. The current reaction wasn't just about today. It was part of a longer story he hadn't been willing to see. It wasn't easy work. It wasn't clean or comforting. But there was something honest about it, something that made him feel more grounded, even if it hurt. As the hours passed, he began to notice how much of his daily stress wasn't caused by external events, but by his own expectations, the inner commentary that never stopped, the habits he'd carried for years without question. Then the phone rang. He glanced at the screen. It was his sister. They hadn't had a real conversation in months. Not out of anger, just distance. Life had gotten busy, and if he was honest, he hadn't known what to say to her for a long time. But he answered. Her voice on the other end was soft, almost hesitant. "I don't know why I'm calling. Really," she said. I've been feeling kind of lost lately." He didn't try to offer advice. He didn't tell her to cheer up or look on the bright side. He just listened, fully, without multitasking, without forming a reply in his mind while she spoke. She told him about feeling overwhelmed, like she was drifting through her days, about waking up already tired, about missing their parents, even though they hadn't been close. It was raw and quiet and real. When the call ended, Anime didn't feel drained. He felt connected, like they'd met somewhere honest. He picked up his pen again and wrote one line. "Suffering connects us, but understanding transforms it." He looked out the window, the city lights reflecting in the glass, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone in the struggle. He felt part of something shared, not just pain, but the possibility of healing. There was a strange stillness in Anime's apartment that morning, one he hadn't noticed before. Not the kind of quiet that brought comfort, but the kind that made you hear your own breath, your own heartbeat. He sat at the edge of his bed, hands loosely clasped, staring at the sunlight inching across the hardwood floor. It was a peaceful image, but inside him, something stirred uneasily. In the days following his conversation with his sister, a shift had begun, not dramatic, but persistent. It wasn't that his life had suddenly changed. The job was the same. The city still hummed outside. But inside, a mirror had been placed in front of him, and he was finally starting to look into it without flinching. What he saw wasn't easy. He noticed how easily his tone changed in conversations, especially when he felt threatened. A slight comment from a colleague could twist into defensiveness. He caught himself scrolling through social media and feeling a twinge of jealousy when an old friend posted about a new house, a wedding, a trip to Europe. It wasn't loud envy, just a subtle tightness in his chest, a sense of being left behind. Even more uncomfortable was how he felt about his parents. He never considered himself resentful. He'd always told himself they did their best. But underneath that narrative, there was a quiet ache. A part of him still wished they had seen him more clearly, praised him more openly, listened with more patience. He began to see how that old longing had turned into a fear of not being good enough. A fear that still showed up in his relationships, at work, and even in silence. He didn't try to escape those realizations this time. He let them come. A few days later, he returned to the bookstore, not to find answers, but simply to sit with the teacher again. The older man welcomed him as always. No expectations, no lectures. They sat over tea, the kettle steaming quietly between them. "I've been seeing some things in myself lately," Anime said, his voice low. "Things I didn't want to see." The teacher didn't respond right away. He reached for a book on the shelf behind him, opened it gently, and read aloud. "There once was a man named Angulimala. He killed without remorse. But when he met the Buddha, he changed. Not because his past vanished, but because he saw clearly for the first time." He closed the book and looked up. "We all carry darkness," he said. "The practice is not to reject it, but to face it, with wisdom and compassion." Anime sat with that, not to reject it. That felt new. He had always thought the point was to get rid of the things he didn't like about himself, to conquer them or silence them. But what if the work was just to meet them? Later that week, the lesson was put to the test. At work, during a brainstorming meeting, a team member casually presented an idea Anime had shared in private days before. There was no acknowledgement, no credit, just a quiet theft. The anger came fast, rising like heat under the skin. In the past, he would have bottled it up, nodded through clenched teeth, maybe vented later, or worse, snapped in the hallway and regretted it for days. But this time, he noticed the fire as it built. He didn't pretend it wasn't there. He didn't try to push it down. He just felt it, fully. It pulsed through him, tightening his throat, clenching his jaw, racing through his chest. And he breathed, not to make it go away, but to give it space. The moment passed. The idea stayed stolen, and no one rushed to his defense. But somehow, he didn't feel like a victim. He felt clear, tired, but clear. He saw the old pattern rise. And for the first time, he didn't let it drag him along. That night, though, the emotional weight came back in a different form. Memories floated up, not the ones he shared with others, the private ones. The small, quiet shames. His father's voice from years ago, sharp and cold, telling him he was too soft, too sensitive. A teacher in middle school calling him lazy when he had actually been overwhelmed. The sting of being told he needed to toughen up. He had carried those words for so long, letting them shape the way he walked through the world. And now, with everything laid bare, he felt raw, like old bruises being touched again. That night, he sat on the couch, knees pulled in slightly, and asked himself something he hadn't dared to ask before. Is this really the path to peace? Or am I just digging up pain I had learned to ignore? There was no immediate answer. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the rain beginning to tap against the window. The next day, he visited the bookstore again. This time, he didn't say much. The teacher didn't press. As they sat in silence, the old man poured the tea slowly, placed the cup in front of Anime, and spoke a single sentence. Before the lotus blooms, it grows in the mud. Anime held the cup in both hands, the steam curling gently toward his face. That evening, back at his apartment, he opened the window. The rain had picked up. It hit the pavement in soft, steady rhythm. He leaned on the frame, breathing in the damp, earthy air. The mud, that was where he was. Not yet blooming, not yet out of the dark, but not lost either. He picked up his pen and wrote in his notebook. This is the mud, and I'm still growing. The next time Anime visited the bookstore, the teacher had already placed a thin cushion and a folded piece of paper on the table beside the tea. No words were exchanged at first. They sat, shared their tea, and when the cups were nearly empty, the teacher spoke gently, like someone continuing a conversation that had been paused, not begun. I think you're ready to sit, he said. 15 minutes each morning. Just sit, breathe. When thoughts come, and they will, notice them, label them, if it helps. Thinking, then return to your breath. No judgment, no effort to stop the noise. Anime smiled awkwardly. 15 minutes sounds longer when you're not watching a screen. The teacher chuckled softly. It'll feel longer at first, maybe even forever, but stay with it, not because it's easy, because it's real. The next morning, Anime woke before his alarm. Not by much, but enough to notice. The apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak from the heater. He pulled the cushion from the corner, where it had been sitting untouched for months as a decorative afterthought. Now, it had a purpose. He sat cross-legged near the window, back straight, hands resting on his thighs. A timer on his phone, set to 15 minutes, gave him an odd sense of security. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Within seconds, his mind went to work. What am I supposed to feel? Should I be trying harder? Did I forget to send that email yesterday? What if I'm late today? He tried labeling, thinking. The thoughts didn't stop, but the act of naming them created just enough distance, like watching clouds pass instead of standing in the rain. He returned to his breath. Then a cramp in his leg pulled him out. Then an itch on his neck. Then a memory of high school embarrassment. Then wondering what he'd eat for lunch. When the timer went off, He was surprised, not because it had flown by, but because he had actually stayed. He hadn't quit. That was enough for day one. The days that followed were not easier, but they became familiar. He sat each morning, sometimes groggy, sometimes restless, but always with the intention to just be still. His body protested, his back ached, his knees complained, but gradually, something began to shift. Not in the noise, but in how he met the noise. There were moments when the thoughts would rush in like a crowd. And then, just for a breath or two, things would settle, not go silent, just settle. He started writing more in his journal after each session. Not full reflections, just quick lines, observations, truths that came up like pebbles on the surface of water. Most of my stress comes from imagined futures. I react to people based on old stories, not who they are now. Even boredom is just another mind state. It passes. He wasn't suddenly transformed. The irritation still showed up. The doubts, the self-judgment, all still there, but now he saw them coming. And that alone made a difference. Then came the test. It was a Monday. He overslept. The bus was late. He spilled coffee on his shirt 5 minutes before a meeting. The old script would have taken over, muttering under his breath, heart pounding, frustration spilling into the rest of the day. But this time, he just stood there, looking at the stain spreading on his shirt like a slow sunburst. He felt the anger rise. And he waited, breathed. Just coffee, just a thought. He changed his shirt and kept moving. Later that day, a friend texted him. Someone who had a habit of throwing sarcasm into conversations that cut a little too deep. The message read, "Must be nice having time to play monk while the rest of us are drowning." Anime stared at the screen. He felt the flash of irritation, the pull to type something sharp in return. Then he put the phone down. He sat with it. No reply, no story, just space. That night, during his evening sit, something unexpected happened. About 10 minutes in, the noise in his head softened. Not gone, but quieter. His breath felt like it was moving through a wider space. He wasn't chasing calm. He wasn't forcing focus. It just was. There was no bright light, no bliss, just breath, just awareness, no striving, no resistance. It lasted only a few seconds. But in those seconds, he felt something that hadn't come from outside. Not a show, not a win, not someone else's words. It was peace, quiet, unremarkable, but undeniably real. When he opened his eyes, the room looked the same. The world hadn't changed, but something in him had. He picked up his pen, flipped to a new page, and wrote without hesitation. The mind is loud, but not all of it is me. The invitation came in the form of a group text. A casual get-together of former colleagues from a company Anime had left years ago. The message was short and upbeat. Just a time, a date, and a location downtown. A few old names popped up with thumbs-up emojis and jokes that didn't quite land anymore. He stared at the screen for a while. Normally, he would have ignored it, told himself he was too busy or that it wasn't worth the trouble. These events always felt like performances anyway. People flashing updates about jobs, marriages, kids, vacations. He'd always left those gatherings feeling smaller, like someone trying to measure up with the wrong kind of ruler. But this time, something inside him was different. He felt steady enough to say yes, not to show off, not to prove anything, but to show up as he was, and see what happened. The bar was familiar, dimly lit, filled with reclaimed wood and Edison bulbs. It was the kind of place where laughter bounced off the walls and conversations swirled like smoke. He arrived early, took a slow breath, and stepped inside. The night unfolded like he expected it would. There were high fives and awkward hugs, forced laughter and glances at phones between small talk. One friend, freshly promoted to a regional director position, talked at length about his new corner office and company perks. Another spent 10 minutes showing off photos of a new Tesla, barely pausing to see if anyone was listening. Then came the moment Anime used to dread. A former coworker, someone who had always treated him like competition, raised an eyebrow and smirked. "So, I heard you've been on some spiritual journey. Like, meditating and stuff? That's new." There was a time when that comment would have twisted something in his gut. A time when he might have defended himself or made a joke at his own expense just to deflect. But now, he just smiled. "Yeah," he said, "I've been learning how to slow down. Sit with things." The other man chuckled and turned the attention back to himself. But Anime didn't mind. He didn't need to be understood in that moment. He was okay just being there, listening more, speaking less. There was no fire in his chest, no urge to prove, and something about that quiet groundedness made the noise around him feel less personal. Later in the evening, he stepped out onto the patio for a breath of fresh air. The night was cool, and the distant hum of traffic layered softly beneath the conversations around him. He stood near the edge, sipping a glass of water, when a voice beside him broke the silence. "I almost didn't come tonight either," she said. It was a woman he vaguely remembered from the old office. She'd always kept to herself, usually sitting near the back in meetings. Her name was Lauren. "I've been dealing with some anxiety lately," she continued, her voice low. "Just overwhelmed all the time. Everyone here seems so together. You know?" He didn't try to fix it. Didn't reach for a quote or a pep talk. He just turned toward her and nodded. Gently. "I get that," he said, "more than you'd think." They stood there for a while, not saying much. The silence between them didn't feel awkward. It felt safe. After a few minutes, she glanced at him, almost surprised. "I don't know why, but talking to you feels peaceful." Anime looked out at the city lights, their soft glow stretching into the distance. "I'm still figuring it out," he said, "but I think peace spreads when you stop trying to be someone else." That walk home was slower than usual. The streets weren't crowded, just a few late-night strollers and the occasional cyclist zipping past. As his shoes hit the pavement in a gentle rhythm, he reflected on the evening. He had felt the old thoughts rise, the need to impress, the sting of being teased, the desire to belong, but they didn't take root. He saw them, let them pass. For the first time in a long while, he felt proud, not because he'd said something clever, not because he'd stood out, but because he had shown up as himself, steady, open, without masks. Back home, he dropped his keys on the counter and opened his journal. The words flowed easily, no editing. "Tonight, I didn't disappear into the noise. I stayed present. That feels like something real." As he finished writing, his phone rang. He almost didn't answer, assuming it was a spam call. But when he saw the name, he froze. Mom. They hadn't had a real conversation in years. Not because of some big fight, just a gradual slipping away. Like warm tea left too long on the table. He answered. Her voice was quiet, fragile. "Your father, he's been diagnosed. It's serious. We need you to come home." There was no rush in her tone, just the heaviness of reality settling between words. Anime closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. The night wasn't done with him yet. The train ride to his hometown felt longer than it actually was. The landscape rolled by the window, stretches of farmland, quiet stations, small towns that looked untouched by time. Anime sat still, one hand resting on a book he didn't open, the other on his knee. He wasn't anxious in the way he used to be before a big meeting or an uncertain date. This was something heavier, older, like a familiar weight returning to its place. When he stepped off the platform and into the crisp air of early evening, the quiet hit him. It wasn't silence exactly, There were birds, distant traffic, the rustle of trees, but the kind of quiet that came from memories echoing through familiar streets. The family house looked the same from the outside, but as he opened the door and stepped in, everything felt smaller. The walls were closer, the light was dimmer, even the furniture seemed to have settled into a kind of tired stillness. He heard the sound of slippers scuffing across the floor before he saw his father. The man standing in the hallway wasn't the one from Anime's childhood. His frame was thinner, shoulders slightly hunched, his face had softened, but his eyes, those eyes that once held firm lines and sharp judgment, looked distant. As if they no longer expected anything. They greeted each other simply. No hug, no long stare, just a quiet acknowledgement. It was the same way they'd always been. Yet somehow now it meant more. The days that followed were awkward in their simplicity. Meals eaten without much talk. Small updates shared in passing. But beneath every wordless exchange, there was a river of unspoken history. Anime found himself slipping into old habits, not outwardly, but inside. He caught the tone of irritation rising in his voice when his father made a dismissive comment. He felt the pressure behind his temples when silence stretched too long at the dinner table. There were moments when he wanted to leave, to cut the visit short, to tell himself he had done enough just by showing up. Then one evening, over reheated soup and bread, his father mentioned a neighbor who'd recently passed away. His voice cracked slightly at the end of the sentence. Nothing dramatic, just enough to reveal a vulnerability rarely seen. Without thinking, Anime said, "You ever get scared of what's coming?" His father didn't answer right away, just nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said, looking down at his bowl. "I just never knew how to talk about it." Later that night, feeling disoriented by the emotional weight, Anime stepped outside and called the teacher. "I feel like everything I've practiced, it's unraveling here," he said, "like I'm slipping back into the version of me I tried so hard to grow out of." There was a pause, followed by the teacher's voice, soft but certain. "True practice begins where you used to break. Can you love what still hurts? Can you stay open when it's easier to close?" The line went quiet again. Anime didn't reply at first. He just let the words settle. Then, almost like an answer to himself, he whispered, "I'll try." The next morning, he chose to stay. He'd originally planned a short visit, just long enough to be polite. But now, he extended it. He made breakfast, sat with his father through afternoon TV shows he didn't care for, read while his father dozed off nearby. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them began to shift, no longer filled with tension. Just space, a quiet kind of presence. One evening, after they'd finished dinner and were washing the dishes side by side, his father cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "you've turned out pretty well. I don't say that enough. Maybe I never knew how." Anime stood there, the warm water running over his hands, unsure how to respond, but something inside him softened, not a sudden release, but the beginning of one, like a tight knot slowly loosening. Later, after his father had gone to bed, Anime stepped outside into the backyard. The garden was still there, though smaller than he remembered. Weeds had crept in around the edges. The old oak tree in the far corner had grown wider, its limbs reaching out like arms offering shelter. He walked over and sat beneath it. The ground was cool. The air was thick with the scent of soil and damp grass. He closed his eyes and breathed. There was no special insight, no cinematic revelation, just the simple truth of being there, not to escape, not to analyze, but to be with everything as it was. The memories, the pain, the stillness, all of it. When he opened his eyes, he reached for his notebook and wrote one line. "The real journey didn't begin when I sat in silence, it began when I stayed in the fire." Returning to the city was less jarring than Anime expected. The pace, the noise, the constant movement, all of it felt the same. But he wasn't. There was a difference in the way he moved through the rhythm of things. He walked more slowly, spoke more intentionally. He found himself pausing to watch the way sunlight hit the pavement between buildings or noticing the quiet comfort of a warm cup of tea in his hand. At the office, people noticed, not in big ways. No grand comments or compliments, but in passing glances. Longer pauses during conversation, subtle nods. He was still doing his job, still meeting deadlines, but something in his energy had shifted. He was less reactive, more present. Some thought he was simply more relaxed after time away. But Anime knew better. It wasn't about time off. It was about what he had started to let go of. Still, he also knew the peace he'd touched wasn't permanent. It wasn't something he could hold onto like a possession. It came and went, like breath, and soon, it would be tested. It started on a Tuesday morning. A project he had been leading for weeks, something complex and time-sensitive, was suddenly in crisis. A critical file had been deleted. Deadlines were missed. A senior teammate, under pressure, implied in front of the entire team that the failure was Anime's fault. That he hadn't followed up, hadn't double-checked. The accusation landed like a stone in the stomach. His ears burned, his jaw tightened. The old fire rose, the one that always wanted to defend, to correct, to push back hard and fast. He looked around the room, saw colleagues watching quietly, waiting to see how he'd respond. Without a word, he stepped out and walked quickly to the restroom. He leaned over the sink, splashing cold water on his face. His eyes found the mirror, and there it was. Not just his reflection, but a reel of old memories rushing forward. A fight with his father, a public argument in high school, the shame of losing his temper in a past job. The script wanted to run, but he didn't let it. He breathed, in, out, again. Then a single line surfaced, quiet, but steady. Before the lotus blooms, it grows in the mud. He dried his hands, straightened his shirt, and walked back into the meeting room. The tension was still thick. His teammate avoided eye contact. The manager looked ready to intervene. But Anime spoke first. "Let's focus on resolving the issue first," he said, calmly. "We can figure out how it happened later." There was no edge in his voice, no bite, just clarity. His presence cut through the panic in the room like a steady hand on water. The rest of the day passed in a blur of emails and damage control. The project wasn't lost, just delayed. The problem was fixable, but something else had changed. Something internal. After the meeting, his manager stopped by his desk. "I have to admit," she said, lowering her voice, "I expected you to snap. But you didn't. You handled that with clarity." Anime nodded, a quiet smile forming. "Thanks," he said, but he wasn't smiling because of the compliment. He was smiling because he knew it could have gone differently, and it didn't. That night, he walked home in the cool evening air. The streets were still humming with life, but he moved through them differently. Not with pride, but with something deeper, gratitude, not for the challenge, but for the practice that helped him meet it. When he got home, he opened his journal and wrote a line that had been forming all day. "Freedom isn't winning, it's choosing how not to be defeated." Later that evening, he visited an old friend who was going through a divorce. The apartment was dim, cluttered with empty bottles and half-packed boxes. His friend looked worn out, slouched on the couch, voice rough from too much talking or maybe too much silence. "It's all falling apart," the man said, bitterness in his tone. "Everyone says it'll get better. But what the hell do they know? They're not the ones waking up alone." Anime didn't respond right away. He didn't reach for solutions or comfort. He just sat beside him, present, steady, breathing. Minutes passed like that, just being there, sharing the weight. Eventually, the man looked at him and said, "I didn't want advice. I just needed someone who wasn't afraid of my pain." Anime nodded. No words were needed. On the walk home, the sky let out a soft drizzle. The pavement shimmered under streetlights. He pulled his hood over his head and kept walking, shoes tapping gently through the wet. When he turned the corner past the bookstore, he stopped. The windows were dark. A sign hung on the door in simple handwriting. "The real teacher is always with you. Walk on." Rain slid down the glass. He stood there for a long moment, heart still, breath slow. He smiled, not out of joy, but from something steadier, a quiet recognition that something inside had awakened. And it wasn't going back to sleep. There was a stillness in Anime's apartment that didn't feel forced anymore. No music playing in the background, no television noise to fill space. The clock ticked gently on the wall, but it didn't demand anything. It simply moved, second by second, the way everything in life eventually does. One morning, he woke up before his alarm. The sky outside his window was painted with soft gray, the kind that comes before sunrise. He sat up slowly, stretched, and reached for his phone out of habit. But his hand stopped halfway. He looked at the device for a moment and then let it rest where it was. Instead, he sat by the window. The city wasn't quite awake yet. The streets were quiet, the buildings still holding onto their dreams. He breathed in the cool air seeping through the glass. Then he smiled, not for any reason, just because he felt like smiling. Over the following days, something began to change, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and deeply. Meals became slower. He started tasting his food instead of just eating it. When people spoke, he listened fully, without waiting for his turn to reply. The rush that used to chase him through the day was losing its grip. He no longer treated peace like a prize to be earned. It came and went like a breeze. And when it came, it wasn't something he needed to hold on to. It simply arrived, stayed for a while, and passed through. One afternoon, he visited the hospital to see his father again. The routine was familiar by now. The front desk, the elevator, the low hum of fluorescent lights. But something about the oncology ward made him pause. He walked past open doors and saw moments frozen in time. A woman reading beside her husband's bed. A teenager curled up under a blanket. A nurse adjusting an IV with practiced gentleness. Impermanence was everywhere. It wasn't cruel. It was simply real. His father's condition had stabilized for now. But nothing was promised. The days were numbered, just like everyone's. Yet, instead of fear, Anime felt something softer settle in his chest. A kind of acceptance, not resignation, something more alive than that. He sat beside his father without needing to speak. They watched a baseball game on mute. At one point, his father drifted off to sleep, mouth slightly open, chest rising and falling slowly. Anime watched for a while, then closed his eyes. Everything passes, but not everything is lost. Presence remains. That night, back home, he lit a small candle and began a new practice, loving-kindness meditation. It felt awkward at first. He sat quietly and imagined people in his life, one by one, repeating silently, "May you be safe, may you be well, may you be at peace." He started with friends, then family, then the colleague who once betrayed him, then himself, especially himself. He didn't feel anything dramatic. No waves of love crashing through him. Just a quiet opening, a loosening of the armor he didn't know he still wore. The next day, walking through a crowded street, he moved with a different rhythm. Children screamed, car horns blared, someone bumped into him without saying sorry. But none of it pierced his calm. He saw a child crying by a storefront, a man helping his elderly mother step off a curb, a couple arguing in hushed tones. His chest didn't tighten, His breath stayed steady. He didn't try to fix anything. But he felt love. Not the kind that needs a story. Not the kind that attaches. Just a quiet, boundless compassion that made space for everything. He smiled at a passing stranger. The man smiled back, surprised. Nothing was said, but something passed between them. Recognition. Maybe, or just warmth. That evening, he sat on his cushion, eyes closed, spine relaxed. There was no search for meaning, no pressure to arrive at insight. Just the breath, just the moment. And then, without ceremony, a thought arose. This life, this breath, nothing is missing. He didn't chase it, didn't try to hold onto it. But in that moment, something shifted. The constant pressure to become, to prove, to fix, it began to melt. He opened his eyes. The candle had burned low. The room was dim and still. And he was okay. Not perfect, not enlightened, but at peace. Later that night, his younger cousin came by for a visit. A teenager with loud shoes and earbuds tucked into his hoodie. They sat on the couch, sharing takeout. After a pause, the boy looked at him, a little curious. "You're different now," he said, "like, you see things clearer." Anime didn't correct him. He didn't deflect. He just looked out the window, where the last light of evening was slipping behind the skyline. "No," he said softly, "I'm just learning to stop looking away." The changes in Anime weren't loud or flashy, but they reached further than he realized. Like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in still water. His quiet steadiness began to touch others in ways he hadn't planned. At work, a coworker named Jordan, always tense, always tired, caught him by the coffee machine one morning. Jordan's shoulders sagged beneath the weight of too many deadlines and not enough sleep. "You're always so calm," he said, eyes red from another late night. "What's your secret?" Anime didn't respond with a lecture or a quote. He just stirred his tea and offered something simple. "I stopped trying to outrun the chaos," he said. "Now I try to stay still inside it." Jordan nodded, half understanding. But the seed was planted. Later that week, an old friend messaged him out of nowhere. They hadn't talked much in years, mostly exchanging surface-level likes and birthday wishes. But this time, the message was different. The friend had come across one of Anime's public journal entries. A short piece about sitting with sadness rather than fighting it. "I used to think all this spiritual stuff was nonsense," the message read, "but the way you wrote it, I felt seen. I just wanted to say thanks." Even his younger cousin, the same one who used to mock anything even remotely mindful, began sitting cross-legged on the floor for 5 minutes in the morning. No music, no app, just breath and quiet. Anime never asked anyone to change. He didn't preach. He didn't sell his path like a product. He simply shared what had helped him, when the moment was right, in a voice that was honest and soft. "You don't have to escape the chaos," he told one colleague over lunch. "You can learn to stand still in it." Once a week, he started volunteering at a community kitchen a few blocks from his apartment. The work was simple: scooping food, handing out meals, cleaning trays. But it became one of the most meaningful parts of his week. One day, an elderly man snapped at him. "This isn't hot enough. You call this food?" His voice was sharp, his face lined with anger and exhaustion. Anime didn't flinch. He nodded, apologized gently, and replaced the bowl without a trace of irritation. Not because he didn't feel anything, but because he didn't need to hold onto it. Later, a younger volunteer pulled him aside. "How do you stay so patient?" "I would have lost it." Anime thought for a second before answering. "When you stop needing the world to be fair," he said, "your heart becomes free to serve." One evening, he was invited to speak at a local mindfulness group. Just a few people gathered in a quiet room above a bookstore. Folding chairs, soft lights, and the smell of herbal tea in the air. He felt nervous at first, not because of stage fright, but because he didn't want to be seen as someone who had it all figured out. That wasn't his truth, so he told them the real story of anger, confusion, moments of failure, and slow steps toward something quieter inside. He spoke plainly, no guru language, no mystical stories, just a man learning to sit with his own storm. Afterward, a woman approached him and said, "You didn't sound like a teacher. You sounded real." Anime smiled. That meant more than any title ever could. That weekend, while walking through the park at dusk, he noticed someone sitting alone on a bench. A man, head in hands, shoulders trembling. Something told Anime not to keep walking. So he sat, not too close, not too far, just nearby, present. He didn't speak. He didn't offer tissues or platitudes. He just stayed. Minutes passed. The sky turned a softer shade of blue. Eventually, the man lifted his head, wiped his face, and looked over. "Thank you," he said, "for just being here." Anime nodded. That was enough. Later that night, sitting by the window, the city lights blinking in the distance, he opened his notebook and wrote one line. "I used to think wisdom was knowing more. Now I see it's loving deeper." As he prepared for bed, brushing his teeth in the calm of his apartment, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from the teacher. Short, like always, just one line. "You've gone far, but the path has no end. Are you ready for the next step?" Anime turned off the light, lay down beneath the quiet hum of the ceiling fan. He didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. He simply closed his eyes, breathed in, and smiled. The sky was still dark when Anime woke, not out of urgency or habit, but because his body had learned to rise with the quiet. He wrapped a soft sweater around his shoulders and made his way to the small balcony outside his apartment. The city below hadn't yet stirred. Everything was still holding its breath before morning. He brought his journal with him, the one he had carried through the hardest and softest parts of this path. The pages were worn now, some dog-eared, others smudged by coffee stains or teardrops. But they carried a weight he cherished, not the burden of what had passed, but the truth of what had been lived. He sat, pen resting lightly in his fingers, and began to write, not with an agenda, not to impress, but as a way of meeting himself in this new dawn. "I remember the man I used to be. Restless, always reaching, needing the world to say, 'You matter.'" He paused and smiled, not with regret, but with tenderness. That version of him, impatient, reactive, tangled in thoughts, wasn't someone to be rejected. He was someone who had been trying to find the doorway. That version of me was still searching. And searching is not weakness, it is the beginning. He let the pen move slowly, not crafting doctrine, but distilling experience. Each insight felt less like something taught and more like something revealed in the quiet moments between effort and surrender. Later that day, he made one final visit to the bookstore. The shop was no longer open for business, but the teacher was still there, sitting behind the counter with a cup of tea, as if the world outside had never moved. Anime walked in and sat down without needing to speak. They shared silence the way old friends share stories, without rush, without need to fill the space. After a long while, the teacher set down his cup and looked at him. "You now know what few truly do," he said. "That peace is not a destination. It is how you walk." Anime bowed his head slightly, not just out of respect, but as a gesture of completion, not of the journey, but of this chapter. In the days that followed, Anime packed a small bag and set off on a short retreat in the mountains. Not to find anything, not to escape, just to be in a place where the wind was louder than the internet, where the stars spoke without needing translation. The trail wound gently through pine and stone. He passed hikers, nodded with kindness, shared snacks with a young couple who had underestimated the distance. He helped an older man with a twisted ankle back to the main road. None of it felt extraordinary, but all of it felt full. He walked mindfully, not because he forced himself to, but because it had become the only way he knew how to walk. There was no fantasy of enlightenment waiting at the summit. He had let that go. He wasn't trying to become something. He was practicing how to be with everything: joy, fatigue, wonder, doubt, one breath at a time. That evening, he found a spot on a ridge where the sky opened wide and the sun bowed gently toward the edge of the earth. He sat down on a flat rock, pulled out his journal one last time, and wrote, "Happiness is not what happens to me. It is how I meet what happens." He looked out at the fading light, the world slowly dipping into its nighttime rhythm. He wasn't holding on to anything. Not the need to be understood. Not the hope to stay here forever. Just this moment, exactly as it was. He wrote again, the last line of the day. "I used to seek peace as if it were lost. Now I know, it was always in me, waiting for me to stop running." He closed the journal. The mountain breeze brushed his skin. The trees swayed with a softness that didn't need to explain itself. No fireworks, no final lesson, just life. He stood slowly, feeling the earth beneath his feet, solid and alive, one step forward, no longer toward something, but with everything. So maybe the real question isn't, how do I find happiness? But rather, am I willing to stop running and finally listen to what's already within me? Anime's journey reminds us that peace isn't something we chase. It's how we choose to meet life. Breath by breath. What about you? Have you ever had a moment when stillness taught you more than all the noise ever could? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. If this journey touched something in you, be sure to subscribe to Buddhism Anime so you won't miss the next story on the path of awakening. Your support keeps this light shining.